Well, thank you, Jordan, and thank you to everyone for inviting me and for you guys for coming to listen, and for those of you online listening at home in comfort. Welcome to you too. I'm going to talk a little bit about something of interest to most of us, because most of us have one, and that is the imagination. The imagination is an important component not only of our life of enjoyment as we watch movies, read books, and imagine strange scenarios, but also of our rational life. Our imagination is a component of that, and so I want to talk about its role in our rational life. So that's my subject for today, and I'm going to the title of the paper is What the Imagination Can Do. It's somewhat sneaky because my real topic isn't what it cannot do, but because negative titles are often off-putting, I decided to put the positive spin on it. So sorry to disappoint if you think I'm going to give some optimistic speech. I'm going to be the pessimist today, so I shall do it in the role of Puddleglum from the Chronicles of Narnia, for those of you familiar with Narnia, to demonstrate my pessimism about the scope of the imagination in our rational equipment. And so I'm going to begin, and we'll see where we get to, and hopefully time for questions at the end. So I'm going to have to bespectacle myself, unfortunately, my age, so there we go. Well, the imagination, as I've said, is a component of our rational powers, and so it joins the ranks of belief formation, recollection, assessment of inferences, and identification of entities. The ability to imagine is part of our rational equipment, but what can it do? It's been long assumed that the imagination plays a vital role in forming beliefs about what's possible. For example, scientists imagine various hypotheses and then, through testing, establish the best explanation for a given set of data. Most of us can imagine what the world would be like if certain things were true, and such a capacity is vital for composing and enjoying works of fiction. However, according to some philosophers, the imagination ought to perform a much broader epistemic role. According to these philosophers, the imagination can supply evidence for our a posteriori beliefs about the empirical world, and others even claim that the imagination can justify our moral judgments. In this paper, I will argue that the role granted to the imagination by these philosophers goes much too far. In particular, the imagination cannot serve as evidence for our empirical beliefs, nor can it do so for moral beliefs. Lest I am accused of being some sort of anti-imagination zealot, I'll also try to explain a positive role for the imagination along the way. The ongoing debate, of course, is important for our rational defense of the Christian faith, so I will try also to carve out some role for the imagination in our apologetic task. Let's begin just by looking at what might count as evidence in one's rational beliefs. For something to count as evidence, I take it that the evidence itself must support a belief, and further that the person forming the belief must take that evidence and base her belief on it in order for it to be rational. Evidence is standardly provided by one's memory, perception, rational intuition, testimony, rational inference, or introspection. And those who claim that the imagination can serve as evidence imply that it should be added to that standard list of sources. As Berescourt, who's a philosopher of art, writes, the traditional list of the sources of knowledge saliently misses out an important one, the imagination. Consequently, if the imagination is to serve as evidence for a belief, it must be the case that the evidence is genuinely produced from the imagination and not from some other source. The kinds of beliefs under scrutiny in this paper are empirical beliefs about the actual world and moral beliefs about the status of actions. A belief is empirical if and only if it is a belief that could be obtained by perception. If an empirical belief is to be justified by the imagination, one requires that, if perception were possible, then the belief could be justified by it. A belief is moral if and only if it is a belief that certain kinds of actions or a specific action have the moral status of permitted, obligatory, or forbidden. Beliefs about the moral statuses of actions are based upon the application of moral principles. Hence, for the imagination to serve as evidence for a moral belief, it must either provide novel information about a moral principle or show how it applies to the action. It's not yet clear, however, what the imagination is. There's probably two locutions to describe the imagination. One could be I imagine X, where X is for any visualized state of affairs, an object or an event, or I imagine that, P, where P stands for any proposition. According to the first use, imagination is akin to perception. Just as one perceives an object in the room, one can use one's imagination to produce a mental image. According to the second use, the imagination has propositional content and is analogous to other propositional attitudes such as belief. Imagining a proposition amounts to entertaining it without taking a positive or negative attitude towards it. Why not admit, then, the imagination into the standard lists of sources of knowledge? What reason do we have for discriminating against it? Wittgenstein and Jean-Paul Sartre both argue that the reason we don't treat the imagination as a source of knowledge is that it adds nothing we don't already possess from other sources. For example, by imagining a yacht, I supply everything needed for the resultant image from what I already possess. Crucially, what I know about being on a yacht is all from other sources of knowledge. For example, I recall being on a yacht in San Francisco Bay with my parents and sister in the 1980s, and hence, though I use my imagination to visualize being on a yacht, my belief about it is not based on my visualization, but on my memory. Further, the imagination involves an act of the will, whereas receiving information from other sources doesn't. I choose to imagine myself on a yacht. I don't choose to believe that I am sitting in my chair at home writing this sentence, or as is the case now, giving a talk in the Ledford Center. I can adjust the image of the yacht at will, making it bigger and the weather better. I can't make my chair bigger at will or make more people appear, maybe would be the analogous version for this room. And the attention one gives to perception isn't the same as attention one gives to an image. In the imagination, what one sees is attention dependent, not so in perception. Seeing something may require my attention for my perception, but what I see doesn't. Finally, suppose we take imagination as akin to a propositional attitude. There's an important difference between belief and imagination. S believes P if and only if S thinks P is true. Not so imagination. S imagines that P doesn't entail nor is entailed by S thinking P is true. Belief is aimed at truth. Imagination isn't. One can see this by considering any cognitive dissonance arises from believing something false while imagining its truth. So imagine being on a yacht and realizing that you believe no such thing. You don't experience cognitive difficulty. Contrast that with simultaneously believing one proposition to be true and at the same time false. Importantly, my imagination that I'm on a yacht won't weigh against my prior belief to the contrary. If not, it won't serve as evidence. So those are the reasons against using evidence from the imagination. And the only way you can respond to those is by providing examples of instances when you plainly are using your imagination to produce evidence for a belief. So I'm going to look at a few counterexamples now that are found in the literature. And there are many around. I've tried to carve them from a good quantity to 2 or 3 just to give you an idea of the kind of thing you have to do to defend the claims that I've made. And hopefully they're successful in refuting enough of these counterexamples so that you might accept that others will be equally unsuccessful. So let's consider some of how we may overcome the above reasons for thinking that the evidence that was supplied by the imagination doesn't count or isn't evidence for a belief. And we'll start with those empirical beliefs. Empirical beliefs, remember, are just beliefs about the actual world. They don't have to be beliefs about a possible world, but this one we live in. So an empirical belief would be something you would receive through your perception on an ordinary day, but today you don't. You receive it via the imagination. So to avoid the conclusion, you have to do something with all the reasons I have given for denying the imagination as on that list of sources of knowledge, which of course would include perception. So one way to avoid the conclusion is to deny that the imagination is always under the user's control. Remember, that was the reason that Wittgenstein and Jean-Paul Sartre gave. If it isn't, then it has the potential to produce evidence for a belief. If I don't control the image, then it isn't attention dependent at all, and it also potentially supplies new information. Philosopher Amy Kind argues that the imagination can operate like a computer simulation. Once set up, simulations don't require control. They just run offline. Since we do think that beliefs about designs, for example, are justified by simulations, we ought to think the same of the imagination. As an example, Kind presents the work of the inventor Temple Grandin. In designing a dip vat for cows, Grandin imagines what will occur from the cow's point of view and forms a belief about how they will respond in the dip vat. The overwhelming success of Grandin's design leads Kind to conclude that Grandin's cow beliefs were justified by her imagination, in the same way a computer simulation would justify her beliefs about design. Since both the computer and the imagination carry out the same task, one couldn't reject one without rejecting the other. Philosopher Timothy Williamson concurs, and he proposes a similar example in which a hunter confronts a fast-flowing river. He must decide on whether to risk crossing it or hike miles to cross at a safer spot. In such a situation, the hunter will assess the likelihood of success by using his imagination to simulate the crossing. Williamson argues that once the hunter has commenced his imaginative river crossing, he lets his imagination play out on what occurs. If, of course, in the imagination the hunter is successful, he'll have evidence to support the belief that he will arrive at the other side. So what to say to these counterexamples? Well, although it's not clear that there is any offline imaginative process possible, let's just grant the premise that somehow you are able to start up the imagination and then let it fly. Would it follow that the simulations provide evidence for a belief? It's not clear that they do. As Jonathan Egeland points out, there is a difference between something that serves as evidence for a belief and the intellectual activity of accessing evidence and taking it to support a belief. The simulation in both cases only takes up whatever background beliefs that are already possessed about cows, dip vats, whatever they look like, rivers, and one's capacities. There are no new outputs that aren't already available from one's previous beliefs. Instead, simulation, both in computers and in the mind, help the believer consider whether to take one belief as support for another. A simulation won't supply a novel belief that are then taken and used as a basis for another belief, and hence simulations won't provide any evidence. One might respond instead by suggesting that the imagination can supply novel information. Kathleen Stock provides an example in which she imagines what her friend would look like in one of her dresses. She has prior beliefs about her dress and her friend, but by imagining her friend in the dress, she can form the novel belief that her friend would look good in the dress. According to Stock, quote, one can arrive at a new belief via an image, namely, where it is true that, had one not had the image, one would not have arrived at the given beliefs. Stock's argument rests on the novel nature of her image. There's something in it that couldn't be found elsewhere. Consequently, it counts as evidence. However, Stock doesn't provide a description of the evidence. Instead, she claims that unless the image counts as a source of evidence, it's difficult to explain the confirming experience that occurs as a result of seeing her friend in the dress. Presumably, she gets it right, as she comments, quote, otherwise it's hard to explain the apparent sense of such familiar claims as, that's just how I thought it would look, end quote. It doesn't follow, however, from an experience of confirmation that what is confirmed is a piece of evidence found in the image. Suppose the dress doesn't look good on Stock's friend. She would be right to think that her imagination had got it wrong, but her imagination wouldn't count as something to weigh as evidence for her conclusion. She won't weigh the contents of her imagination against her perception. Hence, the imagination isn't what provides evidence for her initial belief. It's not merely that the image of her friend looking good isn't good evidence, it isn't evidence at all. The best explanation, then, for what I have said goes back to the point about cognitive dissonance. Stock would not experience dissonance between imagining the dress looking good and believing that it doesn't as a result of the perception. There's no dissonance because the imagination does nothing evidentially for her beliefs. One must note that Stock concedes at this point. She adds that the only novel information the imagination adds is of the counterfactual sort, what her friend would look like in Stock's dress. But counterfactuals are dependent upon prior beliefs, what her friend would look like if Stock is right about the dress and her friend. Consequently, if the dress is poorly fitting in reality, then it isn't the imagination that gets weighed as evidence, but Stock's prior beliefs about the dress and her friend. In sum, treating the imagination as a source of empirical knowledge is highly suspect. Nonetheless, perhaps the imagination supplies what we need to justify our moral beliefs. The political philosopher argued that from an imagined scenario, John Rawls, I should say, one can infer certain beliefs about the rights and responsibilities in society. In his famous veil of ignorance argument, he argues that behind the veil, a person has no idea into what situation she will be placed in society. She could be rich, poor, sick, or healthy. And since there is a significant risk of ending up at the bottom, she will come to believe that there are goods and responsibilities that ought to be distributed equally among members of society. Since human beings have sufficiently similar basic needs, such a thought experiment is supposed to produce evidence for beliefs about rights to goods such as healthcare. As Beres Gort argues, I can mediate on whether there ought to be, or meditate, I should say, on whether there ought to be free universal healthcare by imagining myself to be poor and ill in a society without such a system, and seeing whether I can endorse what would happen to me. Despite the apparent argument-like structure of this presentation, it doesn't supply a reason for thinking that members of society actually possess a right to healthcare. The argument is pragmatic. The conclusion is not a truth about the world, but about what choices we would make given the imagined scenario. Hence, though it might be able to garner practical support, it doesn't provide any epistemic justification, and that, after all, is what we're after. It might be the case that everyone would prefer to have access to healthcare, but preferences don't provide evidence for the belief that we actually possess a right to healthcare. For that, we need a reason to think that it is an objective obligation on the state to provide it. Perhaps when employed in listening to or reading a fictional story, the imagination could then be supplied by evidence for our moral beliefs. Gordon Graham, another philosopher of art, presents a putative case in which David, of course, you know this story, learns that he is guilty of immoral actions. And I'm talking about the affair with Bathsheba and the murder of her husband. And he says we could do this by employing imagination. And you can think of David as being given a story in which he is employing his imagination and then comes to a belief as a result of it. Graham writes this: David's own immoral conduct with respect to Uriah and Bathsheba is being brought in evidence against him. Nathan's imaginary story compels David to see the reality of what he, David, has done. Assembling evidence is often a rational strategy at arriving at a verdict, but imagination, this example shows, can be another means by which reality is brought home to us. If Graham does believe the story has evidential value, and it's not entirely clear that he does just from what he has said, but if he does, then Nathan's story should serve as evidence for at least one of David's moral beliefs. But which one? Consider the options. He could believe that actions of a certain type are wrong, so these kinds of actions are wrong. He could come to believe, as a result of hearing evidence, that he himself has performed certain actions, B and C, call them, and he then could come to believe that his actions fall under that type of action and therefore are immoral. Are any of these beliefs evidenced by the story, we have to ask? Suppose it is the first one, the belief that the kinds of actions depicted in the story are morally wrong. What evidence is this claim? In order to justify the claim, one must appeal to a principle of ethics. Principles such as respect for persons because they are valuable, or keeping a promise because truth is valuable. Are principles like that established in the story? It's very difficult to find any. Principles such as these are based on metaphysics, for example, the image of God, not on narrative. Further, David immediately recognizes the type of action in Nathan's story as being immoral. The story isn't trying to present evidence that those actions are wrong. What about the belief that David has had an affair with Bathsheba and her husband, and had her husband killed? Is that evidenced by the story? Well, suppose David doesn't see it. Suppose he tells Nathan that he has not committed the alleged offenses. Bath who, he says. In response, Nathan won't retell the story or even tell another story. He'll have to supply evidence for the belief that David slept with Bathsheba and had her husband killed in battle. Nathan needs witnesses for the fact for this task, not stories of fiction. The only remotely plausible role the imagination plays is providing evidence for that third belief, the immoral status of David's actions. After all, David does come to see the moral status of his actions and is thereby filled with grief. But then asks what it is about the story that tells him that his actions are of the same kind of actions as the character in the story. And the answer to that question is Nathan tells him directly, not in a story, but by saying, "You are that man." Nonetheless, we want to think about something that has happened to David. If it isn't evidence for a belief that is formed as a result of hearing the story, what could it be? Well, my alternative explanation is to point to the psychology of David rather than to his epistemology. It's not that he garners evidence from the story, but that the story causes David to feel differently about the beliefs he already possesses. He achieves a psychological event that takes place in David when he comes to feel a certain way about what he believes to be true. He experiences something that causes him to feel grief. His grief, then, is a result of the change of affections towards what he already believes. Perhaps this isn't clear. How can someone have such an event and it not least be partly caused by coming to form a new justified belief? But one can see the difference when one's psychological attitudes towards a belief are not matched with one's degree of evidence in its favor. I may be somewhat weakly justified in thinking something to be true, yet feel a certain psychological commitment that surpasses my epistemic state. In contrast, consider a person who has a good degree of evidence for the same belief, yet this person doesn't feel the same way at all. Consider the Christian who undergoes a period of doubt. Ask her whether she still believes, and she replies that she still believes to the same degree as she always has. Her epistemic justification, whatever it might be, remains unchanged. What has changed is her psychological state, her feeling about her beliefs. By the way, if you're a youth pastor, that genuinely is most of the doubt questions that come from especially those who have been brought up in a strong Christian family. The doubt is very rarely epistemic and more likely to be psychological. It's, why don't I feel the same way about my belief that Jesus died for my sins as I did when I was young? And that's not an epistemic feature, but a psychological one. So there are some propositions I am rational in disbelieving, but have no accompanying feelings. I'm rather nonchalant about them. On the other hand, there are propositions that I not only believe to be false, but to which I am strongly and emotionally opposed. There's a great deal of difference in my mental state as I lecture on the coherence theory of truth and Hegel's conception of history, both of which I disbelieve, but only the latter stirs a deeply felt opposition. Robert Holloway writes the following, quote, "Emotions contribute to a feeling of certainty by lending a sense of reality to the conclusion of the argument. It seems to be a fact of our nature that which touches our feelings and answers our needs carries with it a sense of reality." Now, that might be a way to make sense of Graham's claim that this is an alternative way to bring reality home to us. It may just be a claim that there is no epistemic value or evidential value from a story, but instead psychological value. It causes one to feel the appropriate response to a belief. So this feature of our mental state towards a proposition is not strictly epistemic. It is psychological or subjective. Unlike epistemology, the discipline of psychology is a description of the causal relations with all manner of things and the human mind. You can think of the previous lecture was explicitly about the causal relation of various events and the resulting effects. Unlike epistemology, the discipline of psychology is just a descriptive task in telling you what causes what. And so, hence, David has cause to feel a certain way about what he has done. He doesn't come into a new state of evidenced belief as a result of the use of his imagination. In sum, there's no good reason to include the imagination in a list of sources of knowledge of the world or morality. I should say at that point, it's plausible to use it in other kinds of beliefs. For example, in the belief whether it is possible that it could be 7 moons, one might need to deploy the imagination to justify one's belief in what might be possible. But in this case, I don't have to argue against that view. It is merely the empirical beliefs and the moral beliefs that I'm going after. And I would say that the burden of proof doesn't rest on the one who wishes to exclude imagination. It rests clearly on the one who wishes to include it. But no case examined here does the necessary work. So what is the role for the imagination in Christian apologetics? In this final section, I'll suggest what is required is not some form of barrier between the imagination such that one would never use it, beyond considering what I said, what is possibly true, but one that should form a clear conception of its role, particularly in contradistinction to argumentation for the truth of the Christian faith. The rise of political discourse, the skepticism of some towards rationality in general, and the felt need to address issues such as meaning in life have contributed to a decline in interest in making a case for the truth of Christianity. As a result, some Christians have attempted to revise their apologetic task to make a greater role for non-rational forms of persuasion. However, some have blurred the lines between case-making and other forms of persuasion. For example, Paul Gould's book, Cultural Apologetics, is very helpful in most cases, but Gould does include the imagination in his list of sources for knowledge. He writes, quote, "The reception of facts from sensation, reports from others, i.e. testimony, memory, introspection, or the imagination." The use of the word facts there strongly suggests that he would be happy with Kind, Graham, and Williamson's claims that I have shown to be false. Holly Ordway, another apologist, has stern words for those who replace rational argument with the imaginative narrative. Quote, "Narrative is not in itself an argument, and much of the difficulty of modern apologetic engagements stems from the confusion between the two," end quote. Narrative, of course, employing the imagination, offers an easy out for confrontation-shy defenders of the faith. One can avoid making one's case and thereby eliciting a negative reaction by sharing one's own story or the story of another. As Ordway says, the imaginative approach must be paired with argument. It cannot stay alone. On the other hand, both Ordway and Gould argue that the imagination helps motivate people to consider listening to the gospel's claims. Also, I would say, by the way, it also helps confirm or psychologically help you love the beliefs you already have. I would point to the Chronicles of Narnia being a great example of, especially in my childhood, aiding my love of my beliefs that Jesus Christ rose from the dead and died for my sin. Those beliefs were given stronger psychological commitments by my reading of the Chronicles of Narnia. Ordway says something very similar in her own personal story. She asks, "Why should people listen to us?" End quote. The answer is that people need, quote, "some sort of imaginative engagement with the idea, or at least the possibility that there might be something worth seeing." Ordway's care to distinguish the role of the imagination from our rational belief-forming process is commendable. It also highlights a central claim I've been making. There is a difference between the epistemic and psychological status of a belief, and improving one won't necessarily improve the others. Many Christians have good reasons to believe the resurrection of Christ occurred, but are psychologically unmoved. Conversely, many people are psychologically committed to a belief for which they lack good reasons. Of course, improving both is the ideal, and it is the imagination that may aid our psychology, even if it can't aid our epistemology.